Okay, good morning, everybody. Glad you're here. Especially you, Meredith. This whole morning, this whole chapter is dedicated to you. Kind of. Well, well, you kind of do. Your little ponytail, you know. I'll tell you about that later if you remind me. Um, let's see. So, I just want to. We have a few newcomers. So, with apologies to all y'all who've heard me do this, song and dance for a couple of years now. I just want to provide a little bit of context about what we're going to do. We've been doing School of Life since 2013, and it started out as a kind of a things I wish they'd told me sooner thing, which might end up in the title of the book, because it's like I'm this old, I should have known these things by now. So it was fun to just start dumping off some of that stuff, but then eventually decided to put it in writing. And this whole year I've mostly just been reading to you guys the book, which doesn't have a title yet, but just to put things in perspective, I started the concept of the soul, like not from a theological perspective, but from a practical and more human development perspective, really was a helpful concept for me and reality for me. And so I started just kind of shaping everything I thought around that concept. I'm going to make sure we're still going here. Yeah. And so I started teaching on that, and then started writing about it. And so by soul, I just mean our essential, innate, unique, who we are if we hadn't been so screwed up, like who we might have been, or maybe we wouldn't. I don't know. We kind of need to be screwed up to be in our soul too. So, but just that more authentic, true to ourselves. In a nutshell, that's kind of what I'm saying. But in the process of talking about that, so the book is structured with an introduction, and then what I mean by when I say the soul, so a whole chapter about that. And then 6 chapters about just characteristics of the soul that you never hear about, really, that I think are true. So the soul is subterranean. It's, suddenly I forgot. It's countercultural. It's embodied. It's wild. There's 2 more. It's whole and something else. There, no. Anyway, there's 6 of 6 of them. And then the second part of the book is about if you're really kind of serious about listening to and living through your soul in an authentic way, don't be surprised if your soul takes you through learning some basic things that they don't tell you about either. And one of those is breaking up with certainty, learning how to be present with yourself, so practicing witness, leaving I Suckville, reconfiguring faith, transforming fragility, and the last chapter is practicing magic. So that's when we'll be doing next time. So the reason I mentioned Meredith is in writing the book, I'm writing from my perspective. I'm basically telling my own story, my own transformation, and I'm an old white lady, basically a white Christian lady. And people sometimes ask me, so is this gonna these concepts transfer to everybody, or is this just a cultural kind of a phenomenon? Which I had to think about quite a bit. And Meredith has asked that question, not in so many words, but brought my awareness to that a little bit, and as a result, I've been doing some kind of learning about what it means to be white and white fragility and all that stuff, and use that as a kind of a lens through which to look at what I was writing, which of course is authentic because of it's mine story, but I realized that it's not necessarily universal to everybody. Blah blah blah. Anyways, it got me started thinking, because one of the main values of the whole becoming a human being journey is about being able to tolerate the vulnerability that it takes to be authentic. And so we really value vulnerability, but it's very closely aligned with feeling fragile on the inside and actually being fragile. And our whole culture's like approach to that vulnerability. What do we do about the vulnerability of being a soul or a human being? And how we deal with that question really is determines how we then show up in the world, and what we do, what we contribute to, or what we continue to make worse. So, so this chapter is my attempt to kind of, without being an expert in the field, I'm not going to pretend that I understand a lot about racism or cultural moves in our society, because I'm not qualified to do that. But I think I kind of understand what it feels like to, well, a couple things. So I'm just going to read. And I would really love to have a rich conversation, because I have a feeling this chapter is going to need some rewriting, because I wrote it pretty fast. Okay, any questions, anything like that? Okay, here we go. Transforming Fragility. Here's a quote by Kilroy Oldster in the Dead Toad Scrolls, which is really interesting. Every unpleasant worldly experience in life exposes our sensitive nervous systems to painful phenomena. Despite all the beer commercial advertisement slogans urging us to live with gusto, life is unavoidably painful. Life is a battering ram that inflicts trauma upon human beings. People blunt the traumatic force of enduring a lifetime of pain, fearfulness, and unremitted anguish and boredom with religion, sex, booze, drugs, fantasy, and other indulgent acts and forms of escapism. Remedial learning. As a kid, I was a champion reader. My first grade teacher gave me one of the best gifts I've ever received when she taught me to read. I was thrilled. I felt a whole new world open up to me, and I remember feeling as if I could fly. My great honor was to serve on a team of reading monitors during free time. I was chosen to stand at the back of the room and wait for one of my classmates to stumble on a word they didn't recognize and couldn't sound out. I would then step up next to them and whisper the word. It made me feel like Santa Claus, distributing the gift of words to good little boys and girls. Later, as elementary school progressed and kids' reading abilities grew more diverse, I participated in reading groups organized around these diverse abilities. By the time I was a student teacher, we knew that ability grouping can be discouraging to kids who are quite aware of status at an early age. By then, we tried to disguise these groups with creative names. That year, we used bird names: bluebirds, robins, and orioles. We weren't fooling anybody. But as sad as it was to watch kids try to be okay being an oriole instead of a bluebird, the real mark of shame was when they needed to leave the classroom and meet out in the hall with a tutor for remedial reading. Remedial reading, ouch. Living from the soul should be the most essential, necessary, and natural way to inhabit our bodies, something we should already know how to do. But unlike my killer reading skills, I'm chagrined to admit that when it comes to the secrets of living from my soul, I feel like I need to be sitting in the hallway with a tutor. I think I might be allergic to vulnerability. I'm quite sure I'm not alone in this. I find a small measure of comfort knowing I'm not alone, and also from the fact that we come by it honestly. we have a few things working against us in the vulnerability department. The first issue is what I have spent most of the book writing about, the nature of developing a self in this world. The whole idea of coming into the world as an open-hearted, magnificent soul surrounded by the dangers of human dysfunction means that we must adapt and grow and protect our precious souls at all costs. More often than not, the cost is a tragic loss of connection with the soul we worked so hard to protect. Our remedial task is to restore that connection after all these years. The second difficulty is The second difficulty is that we start with an evolutionary disadvantage. In primitive times, those who were constantly on the lookout for potential mortal threats had a higher survival rate than those who lived in the joy of the moment. Those hypervigilant forebearers were the ones who lived long enough to reproduce. Those who were inclined to stop and smell the roses most likely got eaten. Now that most of us live lives free from the threat of physical elimination, we must teach our poor primitive brains how to feel safe and experience goodness in the present moment, where 99.9% of the time no mortal threat exists. That requires remedial learning on a neurological level, not an easy task. The third difficulty we encounter is cultural, historical, racial, and somatic. I'll use myself as an example. Although I'm woefully ignorant of my ancestry due to faulty records, poverty, and most likely a lack of significant players in my family line, I can safely assume that I am descended from some combination of Scottish, Irish, German, and English stock. White America was colonized by people like these. Throughout my school years, I was taught to believe that those early Americans were brave explorers who risked everything to move to the New World in search of religious freedom, eventually building a society that honored life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. This is a sanitized and romantic version of the truth, not to mention a very white version of the truth. The history and practice of slavery was taught as nothing more than an, oh, by the way, slavery was a practice used by landowners in the southern colonies until the Civil War, in which all the slaves were freed. Similarly, in my social studies classes, almost no mention was made of the systematic commission of atrocities against indigenous peoples, the domination, genocide, betrayal, kidnapping, forced clearing, imprisonment, and all forms of repression against those who had lived on this continent for thousands of years. These practices stemmed from the mistaken belief that people of European descent were entitled, even destined, to conquer, subdue, colonize, and civilize the known world for their own benefit. In the name of God, by the way. Aside from these important omissions, I'm pretty sure my ancestors didn't decide on their own to travel to the New World and create a shining example of democracy for all to enjoy. I suspect my ancestors were forced to emigrate to America as a last resort due to the risk of starvation, imprisonment, or oppression. Upon arrival, I imagine their lives were a constant struggle to establish themselves, some even working as indentured servants as the price of their escape from whatever threat they experienced in the Old World. Whatever the circumstances, odds are they came here under duress. The history of Western Europe in the centuries before the establishment of America is a history of violence and domination. Whether we descend from the dominators or the dominated, we are descended from violence. Violence creates trauma for both victim and perpetrator. We now know that trauma alters our DNA. America was formed by people like this, Europeans whose humanity had been profoundly affected either by the moral transgressions of the dominant class or the pure trauma of the oppressed. Americans take pride in a narrative that asserts we are descended from brave, hard-working people who created a great nation despite difficult challenges, throwing off our oppressors and becoming a beacon of liberty and equality for all, the greatest nation on earth. While some truth can be found in this version of our history, it also belies a deep denial of the cost of our success and a profound refusal to confront the immensity of that cost, paid by those who do not belong to the class of Americans who were privileged enough to craft our origin story through the sanitizing lens of dominance. Profound ignorance and willful denial of the deep cost of our success, paid for by African slave populations and indigenous people groups, permeates the nervous systems of those of us privileged to belong to the dominant class. Ignorance, willful denial, and resistance to authentic narratives leaves us detached from the truth of our history, emotionally brittle and self-protective. Brittle self-protection, fueled by ignorance and willful denial, makes us morally and spiritually fragile, numb to the realities of marginalized people, and similarly out of touch with our own true center. James Baldwin described it this way: something very sinister happens to the people of a country when they begin to distrust their own reactions as deeply as they do here, and become as joyless as they have become. It is this individual uncertainty on the part of white American men and women, this inability to renew themselves at the fountain of their own lives, that makes the discussion of any conundrum, that is, any reality, so supremely difficult. The person who distrusts himself has no touchstone for reality, for this touchstone can only be oneself. Such a person interposes between himself and reality nothing less than a labyrinth of attitudes. And these attitudes, furthermore, though the person is usually unaware of it, are historical and public attitudes. They do not relate to the present any more than they relate to the person. Therefore, whatever white people do not know about the Negro reveals inexorably and precisely what they do not know about themselves. Both of my parents grew up on the Nebraska prairie, young children during the desperate years of the Great Depression. I can only imagine what that was like for them, since they only spoke about it incidentally. For example, I know that my father grew up on land leased from the Sioux Nation, but I have no idea what effect that might have had on him, except for a random story about how as a young adult he would go to town with his buddies on the weekends to pick fights with local Native men as a form of entertainment. My mother, on the other hand, was born in a sod house on the prairie. At the age of 15, she dropped out of high school, which, in order to attend that school, she had to board with a family who lived in town, since there was no high school within reasonable traveling distance from where she lived. She dropped out of school to help raise her newborn sister, as her parents struggled through a difficult marriage and eventually divorced. Later, my mother birthed 2 children out of wedlock, each with different fathers. Sons she felt forced to abandon in order to marry my father when she became pregnant with my older brother. Can you keep that straight? That was kind of tricky. None of the details of these events were known to us until decades after the fact, some only disclosed after her death. Those are some intense circumstances which, unfortunately, were never talked about in my family. Instead, growing up with my mother, I occasionally heard her use a phrase that was a common sentiment during her youth. I'm free, white, and 21. As in, I'm free, white, and 21, so I can damn well do as I please. Free, white, and 21 was a shallow reminder that, however tough you have it, there are others who have it tougher, so quit complaining. Free, white, and 21 was an admonition to make the most of whatever privilege you have and don't look back. My parents did that. They made the most of their circumstances, built the best life they could manage, and as far as I knew, they never looked back. Introspection was not their habit. Stoicism, bigotry, my dad was outspokenly racist, and psychic numbness due to untold family secrets was, unfortunately, their habit instead. They used whatever strength, courage, and determination they had in order to build a different life for themselves and their offspring, a life free from the suffering they experienced growing up, or so they thought. In fact, since they had no tools for self-reflection and perceived no need for such activities, their new life became instead a fortress against the haunts of the past that might threaten them in ways they could not describe. Ironically, Their strength and accomplishments only underscored their weaknesses. Although they felt proud to have made a better life for their children than the life they experienced while growing up, and although they felt fortunate to have done so, their fortress made them fragile. Somehow I sensed their fragility, vowing never to upset them if I could help it. Growing up in that fortress, I learned never to ask questions, never to risk upsetting the atmosphere with needs, demands, or strong emotions. I did it for their sakes as well as my own. That's fragility. Through this lens, I can safely say that whatever deficits in my development that led to my confused relationship with myself and my own soul are in large part a direct result of generations of survival-driven, self-protective schemes of traumatized white Americans. The neurosis of our time could be attributed to the brittle fragility that is the inevitable result of generations of free white adults using what they had to build fortresses against the reality of our collective suffering. Unfortunately, instead of turning to help others in need now that our own situation is less desperate, we tend to focus our energy on defending those fortresses against all threats, real or imagined. It takes incredible strength to overcome trauma and poverty in order to build a new life for ourselves and our families. Incredible strength, hard work, and sacrifice. Once that new life is acquired, however, a part of us can't let down. All the strength of the struggle shifts into defending the fortress instead of learning a new way to live in harmony with those around us. Unnecessary self-defensive strategies driven by past unprocessed trauma make us fragile inside the fortress, as if we haven't learned that the struggle for our survival has been won. Fragility is not the same as vulnerability. Fragility is what we create when we use our strength and passion to protect ourselves from what we fear we cannot face. We spend our lives on strenuous self-protection maneuvers that leave us empty and bored, anxious, and deeply disconnected from what we desperately need. On the other hand, vulnerability is what we experience when we use our strength and passion to face the reality of our lives and begin dismantling the self-protective fortresses that keep us from connecting with our soul's deep center. Fragility and vulnerability often feel the same, but fragility is the result of our self-protective illusions, while vulnerability is the result of facing the unvarnished truth about ourselves. Fragility leads to unsustainable, manufactured illusions about ourselves and the world, keeping us stuck in repeating patterns of futility. Vulnerability leads to the possibility of wholeness. Moving from fragility, which cowers, denies, and defends, to vulnerability, which opens, reflects, and releases, is a core competency we need to acquire in order to live from soul's deep center. However, the process of transforming fragility to vulnerability might make us feel like we're headed out to the hall for some remedial learning. Nobody likes that. When my brother was in elementary school, he had a hard time learning, math especially. I still wince when I remember evenings at the kitchen table, my mother and him painfully plowing through his homework. We didn't know about learning disabilities back then. I'll never forget the both of them at the kitchen table, drenched in shame and anxiety. Often her frustration got the better of her and she ended up cajoling him, not understanding why he couldn't get it. His shame and hopelessness got the better of him every time, as night after night he ended up in angry tears. It's painful trying to learn stuff we believe we should already know. The process of moving from fragility to vulnerability can be like that. I have often felt the shame of having to learn something I should have already known, especially as a mental health professional. Thankfully, I learned something that can help in the remedial learning process: compassion. Actually, compassion is the only thing that can help us move from stagnant fragility to vibrant vulnerability, and it starts with self-compassion. I know without a shadow of a doubt that self-compassion is the agent of healing and change for those of us who wish to move from fragility to vulnerability to growth and to wholeness. as long as we remember that we become whole not simply to enjoy the benefits of healing within our self-protective fortresses. We become whole in order to participate robustly as fully functioning members of a humanity that is once again on the brink of destroying itself. Collective self-protection strategies create a wall of cultural separation, racial and class inequalities, resistance to anyone who doesn't look like us, and an everyone for themselves mentality, resulting in a zero-sum society. Zero-sum societies are unhealthy, especially unsafe for those without privilege, and entirely unnecessary. Zero-sum societies are inherently flawed, humming with fear and stress, and the subtle and not so subtle threat of violence. Consequently, one way to begin the process of creating equitable, safe, and mutually sustaining societies is to start with the relationship we have with ourself. This begins with self-compassion. On a micro level, we require the practice of self-compassion because we have a lot of remedial learning to do. And like my brother and my mother, we don't learn in an atmosphere of frustration and shame. No matter how important it is to learn how to be better humans, we can't learn how to do that when we are steeped in fear and shame. On a macro level, we require the practice of self-compassion in order to access all the soul strength we can muster for the sake of humanity, as well as ourselves. We have a lot to learn, but we begin by learning self-compassion. A few years ago, I gave a talk that included loving-kindness meditation to a group of advocates at my favorite local faith community. These were quality people, motivated to come alongside disadvantaged people in their community. I taught them the practice of loving-kindness meditation borrowed from Buddhist tradition. The practice goes something like this. Begin with an image of a person you know who is struggling, in pain, or acting out in a negative way. Close your eyes and see their face in front of you. As you hold them in your imagination, inhale. As you inhale, imagine taking in all their pain and distress, confusion and hate. Breathe it right into your heart. As you exhale, release all that distress with deep compassion from your heart, along with a simple wish, may they be well. Inhale again, all the pain and distress. Exhale with compassion and a simple wish, may they be happy. Inhale again, taking in all the pain. Exhale with compassion and a simple wish, may they be free from suffering. Next, we practiced loving-kindness meditation with someone we distinctly disliked. Inhale their distress, exhale love and compassion. May they be well, may they be happy, may they be free from suffering. They loved it. Loving-kindness meditation is soothing and energizing, hopeful and empowering. Next, I asked them to imagine their own face before them. Suddenly, the talk came to an abrupt halt. I could almost hear the screeching of the brakes. What? My own face? I'm supposed to take my own pain inside my heart and release compassion toward myself? Sputter, 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 full stop. That moment revealed our instinctive resistance to self-compassion. This group of lovely souls dedicated to reducing the suffering of others with compassion balked at turning that compassion toward themselves. Raise your hand if you can relate. We seem to feel that if we turn toward ourselves with tenderness and compassion, we somehow violate the laws of the universe. But only the universe of us. Other people might be in need of compassion or deserving of compassion, but we are somehow exempt. For many of us, our universe runs on the principle of constant monitoring, harsh scrutiny, exacting judgment, and sworn secrecy. These long-practiced principles constitute the walls of our self-protective fortresses. Self-protective fortresses make us fragile, hidden, deprived, and deeply hampered. Self-compassion helps lower the internal threat level we unconsciously maintain through self-rejection, self-criticism, and self-hatred. When we move with compassion toward all the parts of ourself, we create an internal environment of security, wholeness, and the willingness to embrace true vulnerability. As we enjoy the benefits of inner harmony, we create more space for relational risk with others. As we experience the benefits of compassion internally, we are able to extend compassion to those we recognize to be different from us. Internal security creates space for relational goodwill through authentic vulnerability. We want to cultivate the heart attitude of compassion toward the self, but if you're like me, that heart attitude does not come naturally. Instead of compassion, I often end up treating myself with contempt, derision, and abandonment. But thankfully, self-compassion is also a practice, one that does not require a full-on attitude change in order to start, only a willingness to follow instructions. Fortunately for us all, the theory and practice of self-compassion has been well researched, and everything you want to know about it can be found in books and online. Dr. Kristen Neff not only researches and writes about the benefits of self-compassion, she is also co-founder and board president of the nonprofit Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. Based on Dr. Neff's research, the following is how I practice self-compassion. First, I become aware of feeling distressed. As soon as I become aware that I'm significantly distressed, I place my hand over my heart as a gesture of comfort. I say to myself, I'm distressed, or in Dr. Neff's words, this is a moment of suffering. I allow myself to admit I'm in distress, and I take the time to notice all the painful emotions I'm feeling without judgment. Next, I remind myself that I'm not alone in my suffering. I know that all over the world, people are suffering just as I am right at this moment. This helps me feel as if I belong to the rest of humanity, and this brings me comfort. Third, I imagine what I would say to someone else who is suffering with the same emotions as I am in the moment. How would I reach out with kindness? What would I say? I then offer myself that kindness, those words. Sometimes I give myself a little pat over my heart. Sometimes I cry. Always I can find access to some measure of tenderness, compassion, acceptance, qualities I seem to possess in abundance for other people I practice using on myself. That's it. Sometimes the distress I feel is deeper and more intense than that moment of self-compassion can erase. That's when I move to practice the loving kindness meditation I described earlier. It's not a magic wand. It doesn't solve the cause of my distress, but it does make repairs to whatever tears in my psyche I have created by treating myself harshly all those years. The practice of self-compassion is an example of essential remedial learning. It feels strange, embarrassing at first, but practiced faithfully over time, self-compassion heals, restores, and integrates my inner world. I'm often overwhelmed by what is wrong with the world, wrong with humanity. I'm weary from witnessing the enormous amount of human suffering, and I admit that practicing self-compassion is like dipping a thimble into the sea of all that is wrong, hoping to make a little bit of difference. But it is a place to start, a baby step, a move in the right direction. Even a small pebble tossed into a pond starts a ripple effect across the entire lake.